quorum.
Mr. President, I ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today to speak to the importance of passing the Afghan Adjustment Act as an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act, which is pending before the United States Senate. This is our moment. We've been working on this for 2 years. 2 years while people who stood with our military have been in limbo. 2 years when they don't know what their future will hold. This is our time. This bipartisan legislation that I lead with Senator Lindsey Graham is also co-sponsored by Senator Coons, Senator Moran, who is the ranking Republican on the Veterans Affairs Committee, Senator Blumenthal, Senator Murkowski, Senator Shaheen, Senator Wicker, who's the ranking Republican on Armed Services, Senator Durbin, who's the chair of the Judiciary Committee. Of course, Senator Graham's the ranking on the Judiciary Committee, Senator Tillis, and Senator Mullen, with many others that support this bill. Mr. President, this bill strengthens our national security. It does right by Afghans who worked alongside our troop, and from a broader national security perspective, as we look at the purpose, one of the many purposes of the bill before us, this amendment shows the world that the United States of America makes a promise. When we make that promise, we keep it. We keep our covenant. Nearly 80,000 Afghans who sought refuge in our country, who are in our country, are currently in limbo, including many who risk their own lives and their family's safety to protect our service members. Among them are translators, humanitarian workers, courageous members of the Afghan military who stood shoulder to shoulder with our troops. We were right to help those people flee the Taliban and come to the United States, and it now falls on us to uphold the covenant we made to them and give them the stability and the security that they need to rebuild their lives. We know this have worked before. I know this. I have one of the biggest Hmong populations in the United States of America. They came after a war in really sad circumstances for our country and for them, but they rebuild their lives, and they're now police officers in Minnesota. They're teachers, they're lawyers, they're legislators. That's what we did after the revolution in Cuba. That's what we did. We took people and we gave them a status that allowed them to succeed in our country. But in this case, we actually asked them to serve with our military, to put their lives at risk, to gather intelligence for our military. Who do you think is going to want to help us in the future if we don't keep our covenant, if we don't keep our promise? The bipartisan Afghan Adjustment Act creates a more thorough system for our Afghan allies to apply for permanent legal status. It requires that the applicants go through a vetting that is just as rigorous as the vetting they would have gone through if they came to the United States as refugees. But get this, they're already here. So one of the reasons that Senator Graham especially and Senator Wicker are so interested in this bill is that exactly this. It actually provides more security because of the fact that there's vetting that will occur that otherwise would not occur. This vetting standard is a standard that 8 former Trump and George W. Bush administration national security officials called the gold standard of vetting. Senator Graham and I work closely with Republicans, including Senator Moran and the Department of Defense, to strengthen the bill's vetting standards. That is what is before us with this amendment, keeping our covenant and doing the vetting. Both ways you look at it, it's good for national security. In addition, our legislation updates the special immigrant visa program to include groups that should never have been excluded from the program in the first place, including the female tactical teams of Afghanistan, which did so much to support our troops. The entire purpose of the special immigration visa program is to provide residency to those who have supported the United States abroad. And it's clear to me that these brave women should qualify just as many of the men did. The Afghan Adjustment Act is supported, as I noted, by a bipartisan group of 11 co-sponsors. But get this, this bill has earned the backing of more than 60 organizations, including the Veterans of Foreign Wars, as we know them, the VFW, and the American Legion. This is one of their top priorities right now, as well as some of our nation's most revered military leaders, including Admirals Mike Mullen, William McRaven, James Styrides, and Generals Richard Myers of the Air Force, Joseph Dunford from the Marine Corps, and Stan McChrystal from the Army. I think the presiding officer knows a few of these people, and he knows how they have served our country. That's why if you're not going to listen to me, listen to them. Listen to the leading veterans groups in this country that know how important it is for us to pass this bill. We must uphold our covenant. That means bringing well-earned certainty to Afghans who are already here. An example, Nangyale, who began working alongside U.S. troops as an interpreter in 2007. I want to be clear that what it meant for an interpreter to work alongside U.S. troops during the war in Afghanistan. What does it mean? When the Taliban ambushed our soldiers with bullets, they ambushed the interpreters too. They weren't sitting in some office being interpreters and just sitting there and whispering to their boss. They were out on the battlefield with our military. When the Taliban ambushed the soldiers, they ambushed the interpreters. When our troops were targeted with IEDs, the interpreters were targeted too. That's what Nangyale risked, but he did it anyway. Why? To use his words, same goals, same target, same achievement. Now, it wasn't just the interpreters. Another Afghan who wants to remain anonymous because of his family who are still back in Afghanistan, and that's the risk we're putting these people in when they're in this very unclear status. He was a helicopter fighter pilot with the U.S. military. He worked with our troops to combat the Taliban in remote areas of Afghanistan for 8 years. On one mission, he was shot in the face by flying bullets. Miraculously, he survived as the bullet passed through his cheek and open mouth. He shed blood in our fight, and we should not let another day go by without keeping the covenant we made to him. Another story, an Afghan intelligence sergeant, who also wants to remain anonymous, who helped carry out several operations against the Taliban and ISIS with our military. In 2018, while working alongside a U.S. Special Forces group, he was caught in an IED explosion and lost both of his legs. Let me repeat that. His fight with our troops cost him both of his legs. Doesn't he deserve better than complete uncertainty and a refusal of our government to even give us a status, a provisional status, and never knowing if he's going to have to be sent back there? That's what we're doing? Our service members and veterans understand this is imperative. I know every member in this Senate have been approached by members of our own military about this. At Veterans Day, Memorial Day, when you're walking in a parade, they come up and they tell a story about someone that stood with them that they got to know. Maybe that person is still somewhere in hiding in Afghanistan, but most likely some of them are in our country, which is a good thing. But right now, they are in our country. Let me repeat. They are in our country, living in our country. But we right now are refusing to give them the status that we have given past people who helped us in conflicts. That's embarrassing. Some of the most vocal advocates of the Afghan Adjustment Act have been military groups. A coalition of more than 30 military groups, including the American Legion and Iraq and Afghan Veterans of America, penned a letter calling on congressional leadership to pass this bill. They wrote this to the leaders of both houses on both sides of the aisle. They wrote, "America's veterans served with Afghans for 2 decades in Afghanistan. We fought side by side with them, and we saw firsthand their courage and dedication. They risked their very lives to help us and made significant contributions to our mission. Again, 30 military groups, including the Afghan Veterans of America, Iraq Veterans of America, American Legion, Blue Star Families, Honor the Promise, Black Veterans Project. I could go on and on and on. What else did they write? They write, we call on Congress to pass legislation that would allow Afghan parolees who are being evacuated from Afghanistan to have an opportunity to seek lawful residence in the U.S. Again, people that have this SIV status. Then they go on. We urge you to support the Afghan Adjustment Act as soon as possible. We promise to stand by our allies who often at risk to themselves and their families served in uniform or publicly defended women's and democratic rights. The U.S. government made a similar promise. This is a letter from the 30 military groups of our country. They say the U.S. government made a similar promise, keeping it assures that the American commitments will be honored. 30 military organizations telling us what it was like to serve alongside our Afghan allies. Most of us in this chamber don't know that experience. We don't know how much they owe those Afghan interpreters, those people that gathered the intelligence. We don't know because we would go on congressional trips there, but we weren't there in the battlefield. They were. So maybe for a change, we should listen to what they have to say about what they saw. They know that many of these people are here right now, but we just can't get out of our petty politics to try to at least give them the status that they deserve. Many of our nation's national security experts have also called on Congress to pass the Afghan Adjustment Act, accurately pointing out that doing so is both a moral imperative and necessary for our national security. Here's a portion of a letter that was sent to congressional leadership by the following experts. Rick Ozzie Nelson, former director, Office of Combating Terrorism, National Security Council staff under George W. Bush. He was also a U.S. Navy helicopter pilot and Afghan veteran. Gus Coldebella, former acting general counsel with the Department of Homeland Security. Michael Nefak, former principal legal advisor for Immigration and Customs Enforcement with the Homeland Security Council staff under George W. Bush. Elizabeth Newman, former Assistant Secretary for Threat Prevention and Security Policy for the Department of Homeland Security and former Deputy Chief of Staff for the Department of Homeland Security. Stuart Verdery, former Assistant Secretary for Policy and Planning for the Department of Homeland Security. Rush Ashley, former Assistant Administrator for Federal Emergency Management Association, former Virginia Air National Guardsman and U.S. Air Force Reserve. Hans Miller, former Deputy Assistant Administrator of the Transportation Security Administration, and Lyndon Melmet, former Chief Counsel of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. What does this letter say? This letter says this: the rationale for the Afghan Adjustment Act is clear. First, it follows through on our nation's commitment to its wartime allies by providing at-risk Afghans and their families, including many that supported U.S. military and diplomatic efforts for the past 20 years, a path to permanent status in the United States. Second, it sends a clear message to current and future allies, those that are necessary, and this is so key, and it doesn't kind of the first thing you think about here, but those that are necessary for U.S. service members and diplomats to perform their missions in pursuit of national security, that the United States is a reliable and trusted partner, and it stands by the democratic ideals that it professes. This is why Senator Graham and I have worked on this bill for so many years. This is why we have the ranking Republicans on veterans, on judiciary, and on armed services supporting the bill. When I first got to the Senate, honestly, that'd be enough to get this done. That'd be enough to bless this and give it the gold standard, just as all these former Bush and Trump and Obama and current Biden officials have given it their stamp, that this is a good vetting process. that it's certainly a lot better than just having people sit here in limbo after they served our country. Here's another letter from former ambassadors to Afghanistan, because it's not just military groups and national security experts. 8 former U.S. ambassadors to Afghanistan called on us to pass the Afghan Adjustment Act. These experts served under Presidents George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden, and each have an intimate understanding of the sacrifices made by our Afghan allies. Remember, it's these diplomats, it's these military leaders that had to ask these Afghans for their help. And regardless of what people think about what happened with the withdrawal, regardless of people's views on this, can't we just agree on one thing? That we should stand with the people that stood with us. This is what the ambassadors to George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden, our ambassadors to Afghanistan, have said. Without the Afghan Adjustment Act, the task of American diplomacy will be much more difficult. If the United States does not act to support its allies by passing the Afghan Adjustment Act, in the future, our allies will be less likely to support the U.S. missions if they see that our Afghan partners are abandoned. In diplomacy, our words will have lost meaning. And in the unfortunate event of future conflict, this is the ambassadors writing, not me, ambassadors that went to serve in Afghanistan that took on that assignment under 4 different presidents. They're writing, if we don't do this, in diplomacy, our words will have lost meaning. And in the unfortunate event of a future conflict, what incentive would local allies have to support our troops? Good question. Finally, I want to share some words from a group of more than 36 of our nation's most esteemed military leaders. They're retired military leaders. As I mentioned, General Joseph F. Dunford of the U.S. Marine Corps, Admiral Mike Mullen of the U.S. Navy, General Richard Myers of the U.S. Air Force, Admiral Jim Stylianides of the U.S. Navy, General Peter Corelli of the U.S. Army, General Stan McChrystal of the U.S. Army, General David McKeeran of the U.S. Army, Admiral William McRaven of the U.S. Navy, General Austin Miller of the U.S. Army, General John W. Nicholson, Jr. of the U.S. Army, General David Rodriguez of the U.S. Army, General Curtis Scaparrotti of the U.S. Army, General Raymond A. Thomas III of the U.S. Army, General Joseph Vodal of the U.S. Army, General Mark Welch of the U.S. Air Force, Lieutenant General John A. Bradley of the U.S. Air Force, Lieutenant General Jeff Buchanan of the U.S. Army, Lieutenant General Stephen Fogarty of the U.S. Army, Lieutenant General Benjamin C. Freakley of the U.S. Army, Lieutenant General Ben Hodges of the U.S. Army, Lieutenant General John Mulholland, Jr. of the U.S. Army, Lieutenant General Leopoldo A. Quintas, Jr. of the U.S. Army, Lieutenant General Mark C. Schwartz of the U.S. Army, Lieutenant General John C. Thompson of the U.S. Army, Lieutenant General Franskin Wersensky of the U.S. Army, Major General Edward Dorman of the third of the U.S. Army, Major General Don Dunlap of the U.S. Air Force, Major General Paul Eaton of the U.S. Army, Major General Buck Elton of the U.S. Air Force, Major General Walter D. Given of the U.S. Air Force, Major General William Hicks of the U.S. Army, Major General James B. Linder of the U.S. Army, Major General Mark McCarley of the U.S. Army, Major General Mark Quantock of the U.S. Army, Major General Edward Reeder of the U.S. Army, Major General Patrick J. Reinert of the U.S. Army, Major General Jeffrey Smith of the U.S. Army, Major General Tammy Smith of the U.S. Army, Major General James Bo Young of the U.S. Army, Brigadier General Steve Anderson of the U.S. Army, Brigadier General Norval Coots of the U.S. Army, Brigadier General Gary M. Jones of the U.S. Army, Brigadier General Richard C. Kim of the U.S. Army, Brigadier General Chad T. Mansky of the U.S. Air Force. Those are only the ones that signed the letters. So I just asked my colleagues, perhaps we should listen to those that have led our forces in times of war. When they say that these people stood with them, when they say that if we do nothing and we just let them be in limbo, and we know just a few weeks ago one of them was murdered in the state of Virginia in the middle of the night because he was working as a Lyft driver, is that what we're going to do? Just leave them in limbo? Or are we going to stand with them, as the top leaders in our military have suggested? They have been resolute in their support, not just of doing something about this, of this bill, of this amendment. We worked with the military for years on this amendment. They have signed their names to this letter. What does the letter say specifically? It says, if Congress fails to enact the Afghan Adjustment Act, the United States will be less secure. Okay, there you go. We can just stand here and not want to deal with this because everyone wants to go home for August, or we can actually vote on this amendment. That's all we're asking. We want to vote on this amendment. They write, if Congress fails to enact the Afghan Adjustment Act, the United States will be less secure. As military professionals, it was and remains our duty to prepare for future conflicts. We assure you that in any such conflict, potential allies will remember what happens now with our Afghan allies. If we claim to support the troops and want to enable their success in wartime, we must keep our commitments today. The Afghan Adjustment Act, they write, this isn't me talking, this is all the top brass, the top military who led us in times of war. They write, the Afghan Adjustment Act will go a long way. Additionally, without the fixes applied by the Afghan Adjustment Act, this is them writing, not me, our immigration system will be less capable, not more capable, of properly processing and vetting applicants. To break from their letter, that was the point I made earlier about why Senator Wicker and Senator Graham and Senator Moran were so focused on making sure that this was the gold standard of vetting in this bill. Back to the letter. The enhancements that the Afghan Adjustment Act adds to the security screening process of those who were evacuated are of critical importance to our national security. Listening? Even if you don't agree with me on the security of our country overall and standing with our allies, at the very least, look at that. Shouldn't we be vetting people that were evacuated? Maybe that would be a good idea. That's what they say in this letter. 36 military flag officers think that without the Afghan Adjustment Act, our nation will be less secure. Our soldiers will face new obstacles in finding allies on the battlefield, and our immigration system will be less capable of vetting applicants. That's plenty of good reasons to support this amendment and why we have leading senators, both Democratic side and Republican side, on this critical amendment. So that's it. We have the leading people that head the committees in this very chamber supporting this bill. That's how much work that Senator Graham and I have done to get them on board. We've got them on this. We've got military and veterans groups. We have national security leaders. We have retired U.S. ambassadors to Afghanistan under 4 different presidents: Obama, Trump, Biden, and George W. Bush. And we have all of the top brass retired military officers whose names I just read off. They're not debating which bill or which amendment because we've been working on it for 2 years. They know exactly what we should do, and it's this bill, the Afghan Adjustment Act. and all of our colleagues have had at least a year to look at this bill. So I don't want to hear that. I don't want to hear that. Oh, we've got to look at this more. Give me a break. This bill has been out there for a very, very long time. There is absolutely no reason we shouldn't have a vote. If people want to vote against the American Legion and the VFW and all the top brass of the military and all the ambassadors that served under those presidents, that's fine, that's their right. But we need to have a vote. That is the only way we can show that we're keeping our covenant. Until we get this done, we are essentially asking our Afghan allies, people who took bullets in the face, who lost limbs, to rebuild their lives on top of a trapdoor that could fall out from under them at any second. Without the Afghan Adjustment Act, all of it, their jobs, their homes, their safety, could disappear. By including the amendment in the NDAA, we can strengthen the national security of our country by making our vetting program more thorough, such a top priority of many of our colleagues, while finally doing right by our Afghan allies who sacrificed for us. So let's put aside the politics and the distractions. There's a lot of good things in this bill. We've had a lot of votes on big things and little things so far. Where's this? Who's going to object to at least allowing this vote? They can vote against it if they want, some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. But don't deny us a vote. And by us, who am I talking about? Yeah, the Afghans that are here that sacrificed for us, the top military, the ambassadors, the military in this country who have come up and talked to each and every one of us about this bill. American soldiers who are begging us to do something about it. That's us. The way I see it, this defense bill is about three things. One, our nation's security. Two, setting a moral example for the world. And three, showing people everywhere that when America makes a promise, a covenant, it will be kept. The Afghan Adjustment Act, the amendment that Senator Graham and I have put forth, advances all of these objectives. Pass this amendment, show the world that our word, show our own military that our word and our covenant matters. Mr. President, I yield the floor.